I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Linda Hargrove standing at my front door with that clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, and her lips pressed into a thin line that meant trouble. The morning sun was barely up over the tree line of my property in rural Vermont, just outside of Brattleboro, and here she was, the HOA president of Whispering Pines Estates, ready to ruin my Saturday before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Adrian Morrison, she said, as if she didn't know exactly who I was. We'd lived in this neighborhood for 3 years. That's me, I replied, leaning against the doorframe. What can I do for you, Linda? She adjusted her glasses and looked down at her clipboard with the kind of theatrical precision that told me this was rehearsed. I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association board. We need to discuss your back 40 acres. My stomach dropped. The back 40, the forest. The entire reason I'd bought this property in the first place. What about it? I asked, keeping my voice level. Well, Adrian, several residents have expressed concern about the density of the woods behind your property. It blocks views, harbors wildlife that wanders into yards, and frankly, it's become an eyesore. The board has voted, and we're requiring you to clear at least 30 acres of that forest within 60 days. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I felt my jaw tighten. You're joking. I most certainly am not, Linda said, her voice taking on that nasal quality that made every word sound like nails on a chalkboard. The covenants clearly state that all properties must maintain aesthetic standards that benefit the community as a whole. Your forest doesn't meet those standards. Linda, that forest was here long before this development. I specifically bought this property because of those woods. They're protected. Her expression shifted to something between annoyance and smugness. Protected? By whom? You own the land, Adrian. The HOA has jurisdiction over how you maintain it. By a conservation easement, I said flatly. The previous owner placed a permanent conservation easement on those 40 acres back in 2018. It's registered with the Vermont Land Trust. I legally cannot clear that forest even if I wanted to, which I don't. The color drained from Linda's face for just a moment before the red crept back in, starting at her neck and working its way up. That's simply not acceptable. The board will need to see documentation. Happy to provide it, I said. But Linda, this isn't negotiable. The easement is legally binding and permanent. No one can develop or clear that land. That's the point. She straightened her spine, pulling herself up to her full 5'4". We'll see about that. Expect a formal notice from the HOA attorney. She turned on her heel and marched back to her white Lexus SUV, leaving me standing in my doorway with cold coffee and a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. My wife Tessa Edwards had warned me about the HOA when we'd first looked at properties in Whispering Pines. She'd grown up in Colorado, where HOAs could be notoriously aggressive, but I'd brushed off her concerns. The house was perfect, the price was right, and I'd fallen in love with those woods the moment I'd walked the property line. Deer, wild turkeys, even the occasional black bear wandered through. It was one of the last substantial old-growth forests in this part of Vermont, and the conservation easement meant it would stay that way forever. Or so I'd thought. By Monday morning, I had the formal notice from the HOA attorney, a guy named Richard Pemberton from a firm in Burlington. The letter was 3 pages of legal jargon that basically said I was in violation of the aesthetic maintenance clause and had 45 days to submit a clearing plan or face daily fines of $500. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, who'd handled our closing. He listened patiently while I read him the letter. They can't do this, right? I asked. The easement supersedes the HOA covenants. In theory, yes, Marcus said slowly. Conservation easements are extremely strong legal instruments. They run with the land in perpetuity, but HOAs can be persistent. You have all your easement documentation, everything. The previous owner, George Whitman, he was meticulous. All the paperwork is filed with the state, the land trust has copies, everything's recorded with the county. Good. Send me everything you have and I'll draft a response. But Adrian, be prepared for this to get ugly. HOAs don't like being told no, especially by something like a conservation easement that limits their control. Marcus wasn't wrong. Within a week, I received another letter, this one claiming that the conservation easement was improperly filed and therefore invalid. They cited some obscure procedural issue from 2018 and demanded I engage in binding arbitration. Tessa found me at the kitchen table that evening, surrounded by papers and looking grim. "They're really pushing this," I said, sliding the letter across to her. She read it, her expression darkening. "This is insane. Can they actually challenge the easement?" Marcus says they can try, but it won't go anywhere. The easement is rock solid, but they can drag us through expensive legal proceedings and fine us in the meantime. The fines don't start until the deadline, though, right? That's what I thought, but there's a note at the bottom here that says fines begin immediately for non-compliance with board directives. They're saying because I haven't submitted a clearing plan, I'm already in violation. Tessa's jaw dropped. That's $500 a day starting when? Last Friday, apparently. Adrian, that's $3,500 already. I rubbed my eyes, feeling a headache building behind them. I know. Marcus is filing an injunction tomorrow to stop the fines while we sort this out, but yeah, this is getting out of hand fast. The next HOA board meeting was the following Thursday, and Marcus advised me to attend. "Let them know you're not backing down," he said, "and document everything." The meeting was held in the community center, a fancy building with vaulted ceilings and too many ferns that the HOA dues maintained. About 20 residents were scattered in the chairs when I arrived. Linda sat at the front table with 4 other board members. Greg Patterson, a retired banker who always looked vaguely disapproving. Susan DeMarco, who ran a boutique in town and seemed perpetually exhausted. Tom Briggs, a tech consultant who spent most of his time on his phone, and Karen Whitfield, the vice president and Linda's closest ally. Karen was the one I'd been warned about. She was in her early 50s with an expensive blonde bob that probably required weekly maintenance and the kind of aggressive energy that made small dogs nervous. She'd moved to Whispering Pines 2 years ago from Connecticut, bought the biggest house in the development, and immediately started making noise about property values and aesthetic standards. Linda called the meeting to order and quickly moved through the standard business before getting to what she called the Morrison property situation. "As most of you know," Linda began, "we have a significant issue with one of our properties that's affecting the entire community. Adrian Morrison's forest creates numerous problems, from wildlife intrusion to obstructed views to decreased property values." I raised my hand. "Point of order. I'd like to address that characterization." Linda's expression soured. "You'll have time for comments, Mr. Morrison." "Actually, if you're making claims about my property, I have the right to respond immediately." Greg leaned over and whispered something to Linda. She pressed her lips together and nodded. "Fine, go ahead." I stood, feeling all eyes turned to me. "First, the forest isn't my forest. It's protected by a permanent conservation easement held by the Vermont Land Trust. Second, there's been no documented decrease in property values. Third, wildlife is part of living in Vermont, and the forest actually provides a buffer that's beneficial to the entire development. And fourth, The easement means this entire discussion is moot. I cannot legally clear that land. Karen spoke up before Linda could respond. That's not what our attorney says. He's found significant irregularities in how that easement was filed. With all due respect, your attorney is wrong, I said. I've had independent legal review. The easement is valid, properly filed, and permanent. So you say, Karen shot back. But the fact remains that your property is bringing down the value of every home here. My house is worth $50,000 less than it should be because of those trees blocking the sight lines. That's not remotely how property values work, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. And even if it were, the conservation easement existed before most of us bought here. It was disclosed in my sale documents and presumably in yours. I never saw anything about an easement, Karen said indignantly. Then you should talk to your real estate agent and attorney about why they didn't point out a recorded conservation restriction on adjacent property. The room was getting tense. Several other residents were whispering. Linda banged her gavel, which was entirely unnecessary and dramatic. Regardless of the legal particulars, Linda said, the board has an obligation to maintain property values and aesthetic standards. We're moving forward with enforcement action. You can't enforce something that's legally impossible, I said. That's for the courts to decide, Karen snapped. In the meantime, you're racking up fines daily. Maybe that'll motivate you to find a solution. I felt my temper rising but forced it down. I've already filed for an injunction against those fines, and I'm prepared to countersue for harassment if this continues. The meeting devolved from there. Several other residents chimed in, some supporting the board's position, others questioning whether picking a fight over a conservation easement was really the best use of HOA resources. I left an hour later feeling drained and angry. Tessa was waiting up when I got home. How bad was it? Karen Whitfield is somehow worse in person than described. She's convinced my trees are personally responsible for devaluing her $700,000 house. What did Marcus say about the injunction? Judge will hear it next week. In the meantime, the fines are supposedly still accruing. We're over $5,000 now in their fantasy accounting. Tessa shook her head. This is insane. Can we just pay someone to talk sense into them? I don't think sense is what they're after. The injunction hearing was held the following Tuesday in Windham County Superior Court. Judge Patricia Holloway presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years. Marcus presented our case methodically, explaining the conservation easement, its legal standing, and the HOA's invalid attempt to force me to violate it. Richard Pemberton, the HOA attorney, argued that the HOA had legitimate aesthetic concerns and that the easement's validity was still in question. Judge Holloway looked up from the documents. Mr. Pemberton, I have the recorded conservation easement here. It appears to be properly filed with the Vermont Land Trust, recorded with the county, and in full legal effect. What specific irregularity are you alleging? Pemberton shuffled his papers. Your Honor, we believe the signature witnessing process may not have been properly executed. May not have been. Do you have evidence of improper execution? We're still investigating, Your Honor. Judge Holloway removed her glasses and fixed Pemberton with a stare that could have frozen water. So you're assessing daily fines against Mr. Morrison, based on your client's demand that he violate what appears to be a valid conservation easement, while you investigate whether you might find some procedural irregularity from 8 years ago. The HOA has broad authority to maintain property standards, Your Honor. Not when those standards require property owners to break the law, Counselor. The conservation easement, if valid, makes clearing that forest illegal. You're essentially fining Mr. Morrison for not committing a legal violation." She turned to her clerk. "Injunction granted. All fines are suspended pending resolution of the easement's validity." "Mr. Pemberton, your client has 30 days to produce concrete evidence of any irregularity in the easement filing. If you cannot do so, this matter is closed and Mr. Morrison will be entitled to recover his legal fees." "Clear." "Yes, Your Honor." I walked out of the courthouse feeling like I could breathe again. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. "That went about as well as it could have. So it's over?" "Not yet. They have 30 days to find something wrong with the easement. If they can't, which they won't, then yes, it's over." But I should have known better. People like Linda and Karen don't give up just because a judge tells them they're wrong. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Rachel Morrison, the land steward at the Vermont Land Trust. "Adrian, I wanted to give you a heads up. We received a very aggressive letter from an attorney representing your HOA. They're demanding we release the conservation easement." "They can't do that, can they?" "No, not remotely. Conservation easements are perpetual unless very specific conditions are met, none of which apply here." But the letter was threatening legal action against the land trust, claiming we conspired to defraud the HOA or some nonsense. "We're going to respond formally, but I thought you should know they're escalating." "Thanks, Rachel. I'm sorry you're getting dragged into this. It's not your fault. We deal with this occasionally. People buy property near conserved land and then get upset when they realize they can't change it. Usually they give up once they understand the law. Your HOA seems particularly determined." Determined was one word for it. Unhinged was another. The next HOA meeting was the following week, and this time I brought Tessa with me. The room was more crowded than last time, word apparently having spread about the dispute. Linda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into what she called the conservation easement problem. "After extensive legal research," Linda announced, "we've determined that the easement on the Morrison property was obtained through misrepresentation. The previous owner, George Whitman, failed to disclose the easement to the HOA when it was created." I stood up. "George Whitman wasn't required to disclose it to the HOA. The easement is a private agreement between him and the Vermont Land Trust. It's recorded public information." "That's a matter of interpretation," Karen interjected. "Our attorney believes the HOA covenants require disclosure of any restrictions on property use." "The easement predates most of the houses in this development," I said, "and it's in the public record. Anyone could have looked it up." "The point is," Linda continued, raising her voice, "we believe we have grounds to challenge the easement's validity. We're prepared to file suit against both you and the Vermont Land Trust to have it dissolved." A murmur went through the crowd. Several residents looked uncomfortable. Finally, a man in the back stood up. I recognized him as David Kellerman, who lived on the other side of the development. "Question for the board," David said. "How much is this legal action going to cost?" Linda hesitated. "Legal fees come from the general HOA fund." "Right, but how much are we talking? Because this sounds expensive, and I'm not sure I want my HOA dues going toward trying to destroy a conservation easement." "Property values affect all of us," Karen said sharply. "The cost is justified." "My property value is fine," David shot back. "And I like having a forest nearby. Some of us moved here because of the natural setting, not despite it." Several other residents voiced agreement. Linda banged her gavel again. "The board has made its decision. We're moving forward with legal action." "Did the board vote on this?" asked another resident, a woman named Claire something. Linda's face flushed. "It's within the board's executive authority." "Actually, I think major legal action requires a full board vote that's properly noticed," Claire said. I used to be on an HOA board in Massachusetts. You can't just decide to file a lawsuit without proper procedure. The meeting descended into chaos after that, with residents arguing about procedure costs and whether the board was overstepping its authority. Linda eventually adjourned the meeting early, claiming they needed to reconvene in executive session. As Tessa and I were leaving, David caught up with us. "Hey, Adrian, I just wanted to say I think what they're doing is crazy. A bunch of us have been talking, and we're not happy with how Linda and Karen are running things." "I appreciate that," I said. "Honestly, I just want to be left alone to live on my property in peace. I get it, but Linda's been power tripping for a while now. This might be the thing that finally gets people to push back." Over the next few weeks, a quiet rebellion began brewing in Whispering Pines estates. David and several other residents started circulating a petition to recall the board, or at least to require a full membership vote before any major legal action. Linda and Karen responded by sending increasingly threatening letters to anyone they suspected of organizing against them. I tried to stay out of the internal HOA politics and focus on defending my property rights. Marcus had filed a motion to dismiss the HOA's threatened lawsuit before it could even be formally filed, arguing that it was frivolous and intended to harass me. But in early October, things took a darker turn. I came home from work one afternoon to find orange survey flags staked throughout the forest behind my house. Dozens of them, marking trees and creating sight lines. My heart started pounding as I walked back through the woods, following the trail of flags. Someone had been on my property without permission, surveying the forest like they were planning to clear it. I immediately called the sheriff's office. Deputy Tom Brennan arrived an hour later and walked the property line with me. "These weren't here this morning," I told him. "Someone came onto my land and staked these out." "Any idea who?" Brennan asked. "I have suspicions. I'm in a dispute with my HOA about these woods. They want me to clear them, and I can't because of a conservation easement." Brennan made notes. "So someone from the HOA might have done this, maybe, or they hired someone, I don't know." "Well, it's trespassing at minimum. You want to press charges if we find who did it?" "Absolutely." Brennan took photos and collected a few of the flags as evidence. "I'll ask around, see if anyone saw anything. You might want to put up some trail cameras, maybe a no trespassing sign or two." I spent the weekend installing game cameras throughout the woods, positioned to cover the main access points. Tessa helped me put up signs every 50 feet along the property line, clearly marking the land as private and protected by conservation easement. "Do you think they'd actually try to cut down trees?" Tessa asked as we worked. "I don't know what they'd do at this point. Linda and Karen seem to think they're entitled to do whatever they want." "This is getting scary, Adrian." "I know. The cameras proved their worth within 3 days. I was reviewing footage Wednesday evening when I saw 2 men enter the property from the eastern boundary, carrying surveying equipment. The timestamp showed they'd been there from about 10 in the morning until noon. I couldn't make out faces clearly, but the video was clear enough to show deliberate trespassing. More concerning was footage from Thursday. Karen Whitfield herself appeared on camera, walking through the woods with her phone out, apparently taking photos or video. She spent almost an hour wandering my property, getting close to several of the largest old-growth trees and documenting them. I sent the footage to Deputy Brennan and Marcus. Brennan called back within an hour. "That's definitely trespassing. You've got clear signage and she's obviously ignoring it. Want me to have a conversation with Miss Whitfield, please?" Brennan visited Karen that afternoon. She apparently denied everything at first, then claimed she thought the forest was HOA common property. then finally admitted she'd been there, but insisted she had a right to inspect it because of the HOA dispute. I explained that none of those things make it legal to enter posted private property, Brennan told me later. She wasn't happy, but I made it clear that if it happens again, she'll be arrested for criminal trespass. That evening, I got an email from Linda Hargrove, sent to the entire HOA mailing list. The subject line was "Morrison threatens legal action against HOA leadership." The email was a masterpiece of spin and partial truths. According to Linda, I was using intimidation tactics and police harassment to silence legitimate concerns about my property. She claimed Karen had been brutally questioned by law enforcement for simply trying to understand the scope of the forest issue. She painted me as an unreasonable bully who was destroying property values and now attacking board members who were just trying to do their jobs. My phone started ringing within minutes. David Kellerman called first. "Jesus, Adrian, did you see this email?" Reading it now. "It's complete garbage. Half the development knows Linda and Karen have been harassing you for months. I'm sending a response to the whole list." "David, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. This is ridiculous." David's response email went out an hour later, laying out the basic facts. The conservation easement existed and was legal. The HOA had no authority to override it. Linda and Karen had been pushing expensive and pointless legal action, and Karen had been caught trespassing on my property. He ended by reiterating his call for a recall vote on the board. The email war continued all evening. Karen sent a response claiming David was spreading misinformation. Another resident, Lisa Monroe, sent a message supporting the board. Claire, the woman who'd questioned board procedure at the meeting, sent a detailed breakdown of how Linda and Karen had violated HOA bylaws in pursuing the case against me. By midnight, the HOA email list had melted down into complete chaos. The next morning, I got a certified letter from Richard Pemberton, the HOA attorney. It informed me that I was being fined $10,000 for creating discord within the community and harassment of board members. The letter demanded payment within 14 days. I forwarded it to Marcus immediately. "This is unhinged," Marcus said when he called me back. "They can't fine you for defending your legal rights or for filing a police report about trespassing. Can they fine me at all at this point? The judge suspended the other fines." Those were fines related to not clearing the forest. These are different fines, technically, though equally invalid. I'll file another motion. "Adrian, I think we need to start building a harassment case against the HOA. This has gone way beyond a simple dispute." The situation continued to deteriorate through October and into November. The HOA board meeting that month was standing room only, with almost every resident in the development showing up. The recall petition had gathered enough signatures to force a vote, and people were angry. Linda tried to maintain control of the meeting, but she'd lost the room. Resident after resident stood up to criticize the board's handling of the Morrison situation, as it was now being called. People wanted to know how much money had been spent on legal fees, why the board was picking a fight over a conservation easement, and whether Linda and Karen had personal vendettas against me. Karen tried to defend their actions, her voice getting shriller with each interruption. "This is about maintaining the character and value of our community. Adrian Morrison's forest is a blight that affects everyone. It's a legally protected conservation area," someone shouted back. "Then we need to change that." "You can't just change a conservation easement because you don't like trees," David yelled. The meeting ended with a vote to suspend any further legal action against me pending the recall election, which would be held in 30 days. Linda and Karen both voted against the suspension, but they were outvoted by the other 3 board members, all of whom seemed to have realized which way the wind was blowing. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks before the recall election, I woke up to the sound of chainsaws. I bolted out of bed and ran to the back window. In the gray dawn light, I could see movement in the forest. Multiple people, trucks, equipment. Someone was cutting down my trees. Tessa, call 911. I shouted, pulling on jeans and boots. Someone's cutting the forest. I ran outside and down the path into the woods. The sound of chainsaws was deafening. As I got closer, I could see a crew of about 6 men with professional logging equipment, already having felled several large oaks. Stop. Stop right now, I screamed over the noise. This is private property. You're breaking the law. One of the men shut off his chainsaw and pulled off his ear protection. You Morrison. Yes, this is my property and you need to leave now. We got a work order from the HOA. They hired us to clear 30 acres. The HOA doesn't have the authority to do that. This land is protected by conservation easement. What you're doing is illegal. The man looked uncertain. Look, buddy, we're just contractors. We got a legitimate work order and payment. I don't care. You're trespassing and destroying protected forest. The police are on their way. Come on, guys, the foreman called out. Shut it down until we figure this out. The chainsaws went silent. In the sudden quiet, I could hear sirens approaching. Deputy Brennan arrived first, followed by another sheriff's vehicle and then, to my surprise, a Vermont State Police trooper. The next few hours were a blur of statements, photos, and investigation. The logging crew had indeed been hired by the HOA, or more specifically, by Karen Whitfield, who'd apparently signed a contract on behalf of the HOA board without authorization. She'd paid them $10,000 up front to start the job immediately. By the time the sun was fully up, the forest was a crime scene. 4 large oaks had been felled, multiple others damaged. Rachel Morrison from the Vermont Land Trust arrived, along with a state conservation officer. The damage to protected forest under conservation easement was a serious matter. This is criminal, Rachel said, documenting the downed trees. Intentional violation of a conservation easement can carry felony charges. The state police detective who'd taken over the investigation, a serious woman named Detective Laura Silva, was asking the same questions I'd been asking. Who authorized this work? Who signed the contract? Who made the payment? The answer to all 3 questions was Karen Whitfield. Karen was arrested that afternoon at her home. The charges were extensive: criminal mischief, trespass, willful violation of conservation restrictions, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. Linda Hargrove was brought in for questioning but not arrested initially, as she claimed to have had no knowledge of Karen's plans. That claim lasted until Detective Silva obtained the phone records showing Linda and Karen had exchanged over 30 text messages and calls in the 48 hours before the logging crew showed up. Linda was arrested the next day on similar charges. The story exploded across local media. HOA leaders arrested in illegal forest clearing. Read the Brattleboro Reformer headline. The Boston and Burlington news stations picked it up. Suddenly, Whispering Pines Estates was infamous. The remaining HOA board members held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to immediately suspend all legal action against me, fire Richard Pemberton, and hire a crisis management team. They also voted to dissolve the board entirely and call for new elections. The legal process ground forward through the winter. Karen and Linda both initially pleaded not guilty, with their attorney arguing they genuinely believed they had the authority to clear the forest. But the evidence was overwhelming. The text showed they knew the conservation easement was valid and had decided to ignore it, figuring it would be easier to ask forgiveness than permission, as Karen had literally written in one message. In February, faced with the prospect of trial and potential felony convictions, both women accepted plea deals. Karen pleaded guilty to criminal mischief and willful violation of conservation restrictions, receiving 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, and being ordered to pay restitution to both me and the Vermont Land Trust for the damage to the forest. The restitution amount was calculated at over $200,000. Linda pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received 12 months in prison, 2 years probation, and joint liability for $50,000 of the restitution. Both women were also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Vermont. The civil side was equally consequential. Marcus filed suit against the HOA itself for harassment, illegal fines, and the damage caused by the logging. The HOA's insurance initially tried to deny coverage, arguing that criminal acts by board members weren't covered, but eventually settled for $350,000 to avoid a protracted legal battle. That money covered my legal fees, compensation for damage to my property and peace of mind, and a substantial payment to support restoration work in the forest. The Vermont Land Trust brought their own enforcement action, resulting in additional penalties against Karen and Linda personally, and new protective measures around the easement. By the time spring arrived, Whispering Pines Estates had a completely new HOA board, elected on a platform of minimal intervention and respect for property rights. David Kellerman was the new president. Their first official act was to pass a resolution apologizing to me and affirming their support for conservation easements and environmental protection. The forest recovery was slow but steady. The Vermont Land Trust brought in ecologists to assess the damage and develop a restoration plan. The 4 large oaks that had been felled were over 100 years old and irreplaceable, but the forest ecosystem was resilient. We planted native species to fill the gaps, removed damaged trees that posed safety risks, and installed protective barriers to prevent erosion. Rachel Morrison told me it would take decades for the forest to fully recover, but that it would recover. "Forests have survived worse than this," she said as we walked through the Wounded Woods that April. "And now there's more awareness about protecting this place than ever." I stood there among the trees, some scarred but standing, others newly planted, and felt the weight of the previous months finally lifting. Tessa squeezed my hand. "Worth it?" she asked, "to protect this place?" "Yeah, absolutely worth it." The trial and aftermath had been exhausting, expensive, and often infuriating. But the forest was safe. The conservation easement had been tested in the most dramatic way possible and had held firm. Karen and Linda had learned, however painfully, that some things can't be bulldozed or Karen-ed away just because you want them gone. On a warm afternoon in late May, almost a year after Linda had first appeared at my door with her clipboard and demands, David Kellerman stopped by. We sat on my back deck, looking out at the forest. "You know, this whole thing changed the culture around here," David said. "People are actually reading the bylaws now, paying attention to what the board does. We've got 3 times as many people coming to meetings." "Silver lining, I guess," I said. "More than that. You stood up when it would have been easier to give in. A lot of people noticed that." I thought about the months of stress, the legal bills, the arrest of 2 middle-aged women who'd convinced themselves that property values and aesthetic preferences justified destroying a protected forest. I thought about the old oaks lying on the ground, chainsawed into sections before the police arrived. "I just didn't want to lose the forest," I said. "Yeah, but that's the thing. Places like this only survive because someone's willing to fight for them." David gestured at the trees. "Your great-great-grandkids will walk through these woods because you didn't back down." Later that evening, after David had gone home and Tessa had gone inside to make dinner, I walked back through the forest alone. The evening sun slanted through the canopy, illuminating the new growth pushing up from the forest floor. Birds called from the branches. A deer watched me from a distance, alert but unafraid. The scars from the logging were still visible, would be visible for years. But the forest persisted. It had stood here for centuries before the HOA existed, and it would stand here for centuries after. The conservation easement ensured that, and nothing Karen or Linda or any future board could do would change it. I stood in a small clearing where one of the old oaks had fallen. The stump remained, and already moss was beginning to colonize it. In time, it would become home to insects and fungi, decay into soil, feed new growth. The forest knew how to heal itself. I thought about what David had said about fighting for places worth protecting. It hadn't felt heroic at the time. Mostly it had felt stressful and frustrating, dealing with unreasonable people making unreasonable demands backed by threats and fines. But somewhere in that conflict, a line had been drawn and held. Karen had demanded the forest be cleared. The conservation easement had prevented it completely. In the end, that was all that mattered. As I walked back toward the house, the forest around me settling into evening quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you did the right thing, even when it was hard. The kind of peace that comes from protecting something bigger than yourself. Tessa met me at the edge of the lawn. "Dinner's almost ready. You okay?" "Yeah," I said, looking back at the darkening tree line. "Yeah, I really am." The trees stood silent and strong, protected by law and by the simple fact that some things, once preserved, can't be unpreserved just because someone with a clipboard and a grudge wants them gone. The forest had won. And in winning, it had reminded everyone in Whispering Pines estates that not everything is up for negotiation, that not every battle is worth fighting, and that some protections are permanent precisely because they need to be. Karen Whitfield began her prison sentence that June, and Linda Hargrove followed in July after unsuccessfully appealing her conviction. The news coverage had mostly died down by then, but the story lived on in local lore as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of conservation law. For me, life slowly returned to normal. I went back to my job as a civil engineer, worked on projects that had nothing to do with forests or HOAs, and spent my evenings and weekends with Tessa, often walking through the woods that we'd fought so hard to protect. The new HOA board under David's leadership was night and day different from the previous regime. They focused on basic maintenance, organized neighborhood events that people actually wanted, and stayed out of people's business. The quarterly dues notices no longer filled me with dread. In September, the Vermont Land Trust held a celebration event at my property, marking the successful defense of the conservation easement and the beginning of the forest restoration. About 50 people showed up, including several state officials, environmental advocates, and neighbors from Whispering Pines who'd supported me during the fight. Adrian Morrison gave a short speech about the importance of conservation easements and how they represented permanent commitments to environmental protection. "What happened here was an assault on that commitment," she said. "But the system worked. The law held. And this forest will remain protected forever, exactly as intended." Standing there surrounded by people who understood what we'd been fighting for, Looking out at the forest with its mix of ancient trees and new growth, I finally felt like the nightmare was truly over. The chapter was closed. The forest had survived. Tessa and I hosted a small gathering at our house that evening, just a few close friends who'd been particularly supportive during the ordeal. We grilled burgers, drank local beer, and told stories about the craziest moments from the past year. "Remember when Karen literally said she had the right to inspect your forest because property values?" David's wife Jennifer said, laughing. "The entitlement was just unreal." Or when Linda tried to claim the conservation easement was a conspiracy against the HOA, Claire added. Like the land trust and George Whitman had somehow plotted against them decades in advance. The laughter was cathartic. We'd all been through something absurd and stressful, and now we could finally process it with humor instead of anger. Later, as the evening wound down and people headed home, David pulled me aside. "I heard from a friend in the state attorney general's office that they're looking at strengthening penalties for conservation easement violations because of your case. It's going to be harder for anyone to try what Karen and Linda did." "Good," I said. "No one else should have to go through this." "You know what's funny?" David mused. "Karen and Linda were so obsessed with property values. Now their names are permanently associated with this fiasco. Any future employer who Googles them will find the arrest records and news coverage. They destroyed their own reputations trying to destroy your forest." It was true, but I couldn't bring myself to feel much satisfaction about it. Mostly I just felt tired from the whole ordeal and grateful it was over. The seasons turned, and the forest continued its slow recovery. By the following spring, the restoration plantings had taken hold, and the wounded areas were beginning to blend back into the larger woodland. Wildlife had returned to their patterns. The ecosystem was healing. On a Saturday morning in April, I was working in the yard when a car pulled up that I didn't recognize. An elderly man got out, moving slowly with a cane. It took me a moment to realize it was George Whitman, the previous owner who'd established the conservation easement. "George," I called out, walking over, "this is a surprise." "Adrian," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I read about what happened here, and I wanted to see the forest, make sure it was okay." "Come on, I'll show you." We walked slowly back through the woods, George leaning on his cane but moving with determination. He stopped periodically, touching trees he clearly remembered, examining the restoration work. "I put that easement in place 20 years ago," he said as we stood in the area where the damage had occurred. "People thought I was crazy. My own kids argued with me, said I was limiting what they could do with the property someday. But I knew someone would eventually try to develop or clear this forest if it wasn't protected." "I'm glad you did," I said. "The easement was the only thing that saved this place." George nodded slowly. "My wife and I bought this property in 1985. The forest was here then, had been here for centuries. We used to walk these trails every evening. When she passed away in 2004, I knew I needed to protect this place. It was her favorite place in the world." I felt a lump in my throat. I'd known about the easement, had read the documentation, but I'd never really thought about the personal story behind it. "The land trust helped me set it up," George continued. "Made sure it was ironclad, that it would survive any challenge. I moved to Florida after that, but I always wondered if the easement would hold if someone really pushed. Guess now we know." "It held," I confirmed, "and it always will." George smiled, his eyes distant. "Good, that's good. Margaret would be happy." We walked a bit more, and I showed him the restoration work, explaining the species we'd planted and the timeline for recovery. George asked thoughtful questions, clearly pleased that the damage was being properly addressed. Before he left, he stood at the edge of the forest, looking into the green depths. "Thank you for fighting for this place, Adrian. Not everyone would have. Thank you for protecting it in the first place," I replied. "None of this would exist without what you did." After George drove away, I went back into the forest and walked to the spot where Margaret Whitman's favorite bench had once stood according to the old property survey. The bench was long gone, but the location was marked by a distinctive grouping of white birches. I made a mental note to put a new bench there, maybe with a small plaque acknowledging Margaret and George's gift to future generations. The story of the forest, I realized, was bigger than just my fight with the HOA. It was a story about people who loved a place enough to protect it permanently, about systems of law and conservation that actually worked when tested, and about the simple but profound idea that not everything should be subject to development or destruction, just because someone finds it inconvenient. As summer arrived and the second anniversary of Linda's first visit to my door approached, life in Whispering Pines Estates had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA functioned smoothly under David's leadership, focusing on community building rather than control. The quarterly newsletter featured updates on neighborhood events and basic maintenance issues, with none of the aggressive enforcement talk that had characterized Linda's tenure. I'd even made peace with living in an HOA, though I remained vigilant. Marcus Chen had helped me understand my rights thoroughly, and I joined the HOA board as treasurer, partly to ensure financial transparency and partly to make sure we never again had money available for frivolous legal crusades. Karen was released from prison in late 2026 after serving her full sentence, minus time for good behavior. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved back to Connecticut and was working in retail, a far cry from her previous life. Linda was released a few months later and reportedly moved to Florida. Neither woman ever contacted me or returned to Whispering Pines. The restitution payments came in slowly, managed through the court system. I used my portion to establish a small fund with the Vermont Land Trust specifically for defending conservation easements against legal challenges. If anyone else ever faced what I'd faced, they'd have resources to fight back. The forest itself became something of a local landmark after all the publicity. Occasionally, people would ask if they could walk the trails, and I generally said yes, as long as they respected the land. The Vermont Land Trust installed an informational kiosk at the trailhead explaining conservation easements and telling the story of how this particular forest had been protected, though they diplomatically left out the more dramatic details of Karen and Linda's crimes. On a crisp October evening, 3 years after the whole ordeal began, Tessa and I hosted a small dinner party. David and Jennifer were there, along with Claire, Rachel Morrison from the Land Trust, and Marcus Chen and his wife. We ate on the back deck as the sun set over the forest, now fully recovered from the damage, the scars grown over and blending into the landscape. "To permanent conservation," Rachel said, raising her glass. "To laws that actually work," Marcus added with a grin. "To standing your ground," David said, looking at me. I raised my glass but didn't add anything. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and the forest itself was the best testament to why the fight had mattered. Later, after everyone had gone home and Tessa and I were cleaning up, she paused and looked out at the darkening tree line. "Do you ever regret buying this place?" she asked. With everything that happened, I thought about it carefully. The stress, the legal bills, the months of conflict and uncertainty. Then I thought about walking through those woods on a quiet morning, about the deer and turkeys and occasional bear, about knowing that this place would still be here long after I was gone, protected permanently. "Not for a second," I said. She smiled and kissed my cheek. "Good, because I love it here too." As we finished cleaning and headed inside, I took one last look at the forest. In the fading light, the trees stood like silent sentinels, guardians of something rare and precious in an increasingly developed world. Karen had demanded they be cleared. The conservation easement had prevented it completely. And in doing so, it had preserved not just trees and wildlife habitat, but the principle that some things are worth protecting forever, regardless of who objects or how loudly they demand otherwise. The forest would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and 100 years from now. That was the whole point of conservation easements, the reason George Whitman had established it, and the reason I'd fought to defend it. Some battles are worth fighting not because they're easy or convenient, but because the alternative is unthinkable. I turned off the deck lights and went inside, leaving the forest to its ancient rhythms, protected by law and by the simple fact that when people like Karen demand the impossible, sometimes the answer is and always will be no.